First, I would like to state that this was my first trip in almost 17 years. I had experienced several hundred trips with LSD and eaten many ounces of mushrooms back in my day. I had arrived at a point in my personal journey of awakening where I had been up and down the elevator of cosmic consciousness over and over again. At the apex of my last experience with LSD, I was asked to purify myself and wait for the calling. Now, while I am not the type of person who worships anthropomorphic deifications, to the contrary, I practice Zen Buddhism and prefer to meditate on the void. However, in the presence of such divine authority, I humbly accepted this message and have been patiently awaiting an invitation for a return journey of awakening through the imbibing of a sacred psychedelic substance. I go into such elaborate detail here, as I want to convey that I do not believe these powerful hallucinogens are some form of entertainment. I do not trip for the fun of it anymore. I know they are shamanic medicines for the human soul, and not to be taken lightly. I have been sleeping and dreaming my own illusory mirage these many years. I have been true to the message I had received from this supreme goddess. Frankly, I can't tell you why I needed to wait, or why the divine entity took the form of a goddess. Regardless, I am a firm believer that timing is everything. So, when a good friend of mine asked me 2 weeks ago, "Want to trip on some DMT?" I politely declined. Now, somewhere in the back of my mind, I recalled reading about this substance but had never tried it or knew anyone else who had taken it, at least to my knowledge. I explained to him my situation, and he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and said, "It's up to you." I replied, "Maybe you know something I don't." He just smiled and told me to take it with me, and I could decide later on whether to try or not to try it. So, I meditated on the possibility for 7 days. Indeed, I felt an inner calling, so I decided to give it a go. Did I really make the decision, or was I just accepting the invitation to once again merge with the One? Do we ever really make our own choices? Sometimes I wonder. I have always believed that I should go into any new drug experience without preconceptions, so I did not research other people's DMT journeys. I wanted to be completely open to whatever the experience had to teach me. This might be a dangerous path to travel, but it has always been my way. I strongly believe in the spontaneous flow of existence, and besides, who really needs all that extra stuff in their mind, on the threshold of self-obliteration or ego death? With minimal instruction, I proceeded to explore this new chemical pathway to a higher state of consciousness. I had been given a small gel capsule containing the DMT, yellow-orange crystalline powder. I instinctively separated the amount into 4 small piles, each slightly larger than the previous pile. As I had been instructed to do, I loaded a small pinch of skunk into my glass bowl and protected the DMT from direct contact with the flame from my lighter. Ganja has always been a dear friend, so I figured it would be a nice combination and perhaps soften the intensity a bit. Turns out, it was like trying to soften a hurricane with a fly swatter. I sat on the couch with my legs crossed and prepared to cross into another territory, or rather, another dimension. Upon my first deep inhalation, I was shocked by the foul chemical taste. Probably the only part of the trip I really didn't care for. I held it in as long as I could stand to. After my exhalation, I quickly took a second deep inhalation from the pipe. Trying hard not to gag on the thick smoke, I really don't remember my second exhalation at all. Suddenly, I heard a loud auditory ringing in my ears, accompanied by the familiar droning of the universal sound. Almost instantly, I was treated to an explosion of colourful visual patterns. I was drawn within myself and caught up in a rushing force of unlimited energy. Having had many prior journeys with LSD, psilocybin mushrooms and mescaline, I had learned enough to surrender to the pull and merge with the moment. Now, did I really have any choice? Hardly. Within seconds, I became aware of my chakras being activated. This kind of came as a surprise, as I no longer considered myself a practicing yogi. As I drew the energy up my spine, I had intense visions of these multifarious levels, even as my spirit rose higher and higher. I won't go into elaborate detail about the myriad of horrifying and alternately tremendously beautiful visions. It would take a whole book to describe everything I can remember about the thousands of visual impressions flashing before me. I released them each as they emerged and consciously moved on to higher and yet higher levels of awareness. When the rushing force propelled up, my spinal column had reached my third eye. I became cognizant of what I used to refer to as the grid. The predominant colours I saw were a bright green colour, with just a hint of blue to it, and a lavender magenta purple. Wow. This amazed me, as I recalled a whole rainbow of colours under the influence of LSD. I remember thinking to myself, these colours remind me of peyote and mescaline. Must be a similar place. I saw curved linear lines of crisscrossing coloured light. These rays of colour were swelling and undulating out of a central point of blinding white light. This grid was circular in its formation and was superimposed over everything I looked at, inside and outside. I'd become increasingly aware of my breathing and the beating of my heart, almost as if my physical body was trying to remind me of my mortality. In truth, I know now that my heart chakra and throat chakra were pulling on my awareness. Perhaps some kind of built-in safety valve, or maybe just the gravity of self, insisting on attention. Having more than 36 years of sitting meditation under my belt, I calmly centered my breathing and proceeded to raise the energy back up in an effort to merge with the great light, which seemed to be calling to me, drawing me further and further within. As I looked with my mind's eye, I could see clearly that at every point that these lines of colourful energy intersected, there was a point of that same blinding white light. It occurred to me that I was observing the interior blueprint of the Great Spirit, hidden within each particle of the entire panorama of the physical universe. Much like Einstein's theory of an undifferentiated, indivisible field of energy and being, secretly inherent within the illusion of time, space, and duality. At this very moment, I returned to myself and became aware of my body, and the fact that I was a separate, individual self or consciousness. Yes, I was back again, and what seemed like an eternity was in fact a little over 15 minutes of time. Once more, my fear, paranoia, and selfishness had pulled me back down. Me, myself, and I. Again. After stretching into some hatha yoga postures and doing some tai chi chuan, I gradually came out of the rushing current of this force. I reflected upon the journey and loaded another bowl. I believe I waited more than an hour to light it up. Yeah, I do remember looking at my watch, although at first I couldn't really figure out what the mysterious symbols on its face meant. In a little while, I was completely back to my earthly dream state and ready for another trip. I won't go into too much detail about my perceptions of the second DMT liftoff, as it was quite similar to the first. Granted, it was easier to access this dimension since I was familiar with the terrain. Even so, each successive liftoff into the raging current of this force brought me slightly higher and deeper into this matrix of electrifying power. After another hour or so, the third shot projected me to the place where I understood what the grid actually was. I realized that the finite barrier of being an observer of the observed phenomenon still existed within my being. I could see that what I visualized as a mandala-like geometric pattern swirling in a galactic spiraling whirl was emanating from the crown of my head. I remember hearing an ethereal voice say, "The thousand-petaled lotus." Yes, I had risen to the awareness of the seventh chakra. I was actually seeing it through my third eye, literally looking directly up at it overhead. This, however, was not enough to achieve complete union, and I hesitated, on the verge of dissolving myself into the clear light of the One. Moments later, I was separated from this transition point and back to the ego-driven sense of me. I had come to the point of loading my fourth dose and wanted to wait long enough to maximize the potential. I began to look closely at the DMT and noticed a rather large crystal poking out of the powdered crystalline stuff. It was beautiful and glistened in the sunlight. I had the intuition that this golden crystal was waiting for me to cross into another level of reality, the realm beyond witness and witnessed, self and other experiencer, and that which is experienced. After my fourth dose had been smoked, I was explosively propelled towards the boundary of the eternal. I still recall viewing the grid above me. One of my last thoughts was that it was like a grand, cosmic, ballooning hat, right on top of my head. It reminded me of some of the Mayan terracotta sculptures I've seen. Now, this hat was simultaneously expanding outwards into infinity and pulling internally within itself, also an infinity. Just as I perceived these billions of brilliant glowing white lights shining at the intersecting points of the colourful mandala pattern, I had the realization that these lights were all of the sentient beings within the fabric of creation. Each bright light was another individuated, third eye, connected to the totality. Each consciousness united with each other and was intricately woven into this fantastic, I realized my oneness with each of these stars and recognized that they were each a separate reflection of the great light emanating from the center of the grid. As I recall it now, I had another revelation. Thus, I had just one last thought before dissolving into silence. The grid is God. The omniscience and the omnipotence of this consciousness was nearly unbearable to behold. I can well imagine how the biblical Moses must have felt as he fell, terrified, upon the ground before the burning bush. While I was tempted to worship this God as my one Lord and Saviour, I knew that I must sacrifice myself fully and merge completely with it. So, I even had to let go of this ecstasy, for it was the last barrier. Of course, there are no human words that can come close to describing the state of consciousness, wherein we die, so to speak, as a separate self and experience union with the Absolute. Zen Buddhists refer to this as the void. It could be named the Christ, the Tao, the Great Spirit, or the Godhead. But seriously, I can't detail it anymore, as I wasn't conscious of being me while observing the divine and living presence of God. I was awakened to my own true self. I was absorbed into I am. There was no longer any shred of duality to cling to at all. I vaguely recall the feeling of extreme bliss as I evaporated into the oneness. The last spark of recollection I have of this powerful DMT peak is a profound stillness within the center of this cyclone of pure, boundless energy. Then, absolute silence followed. After some time, I awoke into my ordinary dream world, living on the other side. Oddly enough, I was standing with my arms outstretched, resembling the letter T. Or was it a cross? I don't remember uncrossing my legs and standing up. My palms were facing upwards and I had tears streaming from the corners of my eyes. My upturned face wore a broad grin, and I could feel my heart beating evenly again. I took a deep breath, and to this day, I cannot remember if I had been breathing at all, or even if my heart had been beating. Must have been, but I was not watching the panorama for a short interlude. I suspect I had gotten so focused on the inner journey that I was returning from a single profound moment, free of time. It has been 6 days since my DMT experience, and I have been undergoing deep meditations every day since the trip. All in all, the whole process took less than 5 hours, but the inspiration lives on. Returning to normal consciousness and an ordinary chemical condition is both exhilarating and a little depressing. After all, who doesn't want to be perpetually awake? Until another moment outside of myself, I must go to sleep once again. Still, I thank my lucky stars I was gifted with this powerful experience. I am reminded of a silly little poem I wrote when I was a mere boy of 22 years old. I'd been up all night on LSD and arrived at the very same state of being. At the time, I really felt I had found a way to speak about my deep revelation. Frankly, I'd even forgotten all about it until this recent DMT trip. It goes like this. There is no self to which I cling, for I am one with everything. Just goes to show that words fall so very shy of the mark. Even so, I will quote that most illumined Chinese sage who wrote the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu said, "The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao." God bless him. Since I came down, I have been reading about the effects of DMT and researching the journeys others have had with DMT. In the process, I decided to share my voyage with you folks. Sorry to be so verbose, but it is super hard to vocalize about such wonders and keep it brief. Peace to all of you, my family and dear friends. May your way be clear and may the great light shine in your minds and hearts forever. I love you all.